Zoe Turner, a seamstress living modestly in her small, sunlit apartment, had spent months counting her pennies and mending countless hems and seams. Each stitch was a small step toward a dream, a luxury wine tour at the renowned estate just outside of town. Known for its boutique wines and sophisticated ambience, the winery represented a world utterly apart from her own, yet it was a moment she yearned to experience. On the day of the tour, Zoe dressed in her finest, an elegant, albeit worn, homemade dress that whispered of resilience rather than fashion. Her old fabric tote, frayed but beloved, bumped against her side as she walked through the ornate gates, heart pounding in anticipation. While she had diligently memorized terms from the tour brochure, anxiety about her unpracticed tongue lingered. Inside, the winery shone with opulence, vaulted ceilings, gleaming floors, and the aromatic promise of vintages that spoke in silken tones of the earth. Her senses danced with the mixture of oak, fruit, and a world of indulgence she'd never known. But, amid the elegance, Zoe couldn't help feeling the weight of her own simplicity. As the tour began, Zoe faltered on the words she had studied, stumbling over Merlot with a hopeful but unsteady confidence. The guide, refined and sharp, latched onto her misstep. "It's Merlot, not Merlot." "Are you sure you meant to book this tour?" The guide's voice cut through, the room now hushed and watchful. The laughter that rippled from a few guests struck Zoe harder than she expected. Embarrassment reddened her cheeks as her heart sank. The dream of belonging transformed into a sense of exclusion, sharp and immediate. Zoe stood frozen, her face glowing with a redness that felt as bright as the setting sun. Around her, the stifling silence of the tasting room had given way to a few uncomfortable laughs and awkward whispers. Some guests exchanged amused glances, nudging each other, as if relishing a kind of validation. Others maintained a polite facade and averted their eyes, unwilling to partake in her public humiliation yet doing nothing to interrupt the guide's derision. "Do they honestly let anyone in these days?" murmured one elegantly dressed woman to her partner, her voice carrying just far enough for Zoe to hear. Zoe's heart sank further as the scene unfolded, each flicker of disdain carving deeper into her spirit. Hoping to salvage what little pride she could muster, Zoe turned on her heel, quietly making her exit through a side door she had noticed earlier. The freedom outside was cold against her flushed cheeks, the brisk autumn air contrasting with the warmth of her shame. She sought refuge in the manicured garden, slumping onto an iron bench partially obscured by high hedges. Here, at least, she could gather her thoughts, somewhat shielded from pitying or judgmental eyes. The elegance she had longed to touch was now a cruel reminder of distances too broad to cross. How had a simple mispronunciation turned her into an object of such ridicule? It stung, more deeply than she had anticipated. As she sat, trying to will away the embarrassment, memories filtered through her mind, a montage of her long days and longer evenings sewing buttons, hemming trousers, repairing time-worn dresses with unyielding patience. Each piece she mended was $1 saved, an inch closer to the special experience she had promised herself after the many months of ceaseless toil. Zoe's humble profession was one of endurance, her fingers deft from years of guiding fabric under humming needles. She had often joked about the irony that while mending clothes, she never seemed able to stitch the frayed edges of her own life together more securely. And here, on this day meant to be a celebration of her small triumphs over relentless hardship, everything had unraveled with one patronizing comment. Yet, beneath the initial wave of embarrassment was a lingering sorrow, one rooted in why she had booked this wine tour at all. Zoe had hoped this visit would be a start of something new, a celebration not only of her survival but also a step towards self-care. As her physician had gently suggested, find joy, and your health will naturally follow. There was also another quiet reason. Every time Zoe passed the winery on the bus rides home, seated in the window seat she preferred for its fleeting views of unclaimed beauty, she had whispered to herself how she would one day be among the privileged visitors who wandered through its lush vineyards. She had seen it as an affirmation of her own worth, an excursion out of routine into a fantasy scripted by vineyards and vintages. She never imagined that so much yearning could culminate in such unchecked humiliation. With each passing memory, the the sting of the earlier moment ebbed into an ache, soft but persistent. Why did judgment come so readily from those with power and privilege? Quietly, Zoe allowed her thoughts to quiet, the rustle of leaves and the distant murmur of other tours calming her. Her head hung forward, hands clasped together, fingers idly tracing the creases time had etched. Other visitors strolled nearby, their laughter muted by distance, unaware of the scene that had played out not so long ago. To them, this place still resonated with joy untarnished by hurtful interruptions. And perhaps, she thought, that was what allowed her to sit here, beneath the sky marred only by clouds, not by derision or snobbery. In the quiet, solitude offered space for reflection perhaps more valuable than any tour had promised. But this did not quell her heartache. Sitting alone on the bench, Zoe rejected the part of her that whispered to rise, return, and confront the room with dignity. It would remain unentangled from her life's fabric, a blunt reminder to stick to paths guaranteed not to wound so easily. Yet she also began to recognize that it was this same reserve, the resilience to carry on despite moments like this, that had allowed her to create an oasis in adversity, to provide services often taken for granted by those who paid little heed to the hands that crafted their comfort. Her thoughts wandered to the people she loved, the community of clients who returned time after time for her sewing skills, not for pretense or airs. There, she was cherished for her craft, her kindness, her sense of humor. It brought fresh tears to her eyes to know how differently she could be regarded, depending on which side of life one viewed her from. Here, she was a simple woman expected to blend quietly into the background. At home, she was essential, appreciated, a cornerstone. Time slipped by unnoticed as Zoe reconciled these thoughts, and gradually the sting of exclusion paled against the beauty of her own internal reconciliations. Though the dream of this grand experience had ended shuttered by unfamiliar prejudice, she understood that self-worth had little to do with others' perceptions. It was time to pick up the pieces, dusty or gleaming, and stitch them into the tapestry of her life where they belonged, uniquely her own. With renewed resolve softening the sharp edges of her frustration, Zoe took a deep breath and stood up from the bench. She knew there would be other vineyards, other dreams to pursue. For now, however, she would let this dream lay crumpled, a setback repurposed into another step forward. In the muted glow of the evening, Zoe Turner left the winery's grounds behind, the weight of exclusion replaced by a resolve to never allow scorn to overshadow her inner strength. After sitting in the garden with her thoughts and emotions tangled like threads in an old seam, Zoe knew she had to pull herself back together and leave. The day's light was beginning to soften, spreading longer shadows across the vineyard as if drawing a curtain over her bitter experience. She smoothed her dress, a calming gesture of familiarity, and stood, casting a last glance at the estate before turning to walk away. But a few steps along the gravel path, something caught her attention, a sound out of place in the otherwise serene scene. It was faint and rhythmic, almost like the tap of a distant metronome on a wrong beat. Curiosity and her seamstress instinct for details drew her toward a side entrance flanked by towering hedges. As she approached, she realized it was the rattling cadence of a door handle, jiggling as if being tested or possibly stuck. Looking around to make sure she was alone, Zoe cautiously poked her head inside the slightly ajar entrance. The interior was dim, but the rows of wine barrels were unmistakable, stacked like sentinels in the cellar's cool embrace. It was here she also overheard the faint murmur of two voices from deeper within the shadowed expanse. "It's not safe, leaving it locked like that," complained one voice, gruff with agitation. "I told him weeks ago those fire exits need to be accessible. What if something happens?" The other voice, sharper, responded defensively, "It's off hours, nobody important's here to check. And it's cheaper than fixing the alarm systems, you know how he runs this place." Their conversation placed a chill in Zoe's bones deeper than any chilled wine she had hoped to sample that day. It wasn't just an unguarded managerial oversight, the recklessness was deliberate. Locked exit doors, provided solely to satisfy appearances rather than safety protocols, were an invisible hazard threatening guests unaware of the winery's sinister priorities. Zoe felt a familiar rise of indignation. Here lay the crux of her earlier treatment, pride maintained at the expense of integrity, behind the polished veneer the winery so carefully cultivated. Her earlier humiliation at the tasting room now felt like part of a larger indifference invested in superficial success. Concerned, she retraced her way out, slipping quietly to a hidden corner of the garden where she could act unnoticed. Her pulse quickened as she brought out her phone, drawing on the courage she had rediscovered a little earlier. With a few shaky breaths to calm her nerves, she snapped a picture of the ominously locked fire exit door and recorded part of the hurried conversation she'd overheard. Protecting others, even anonymously, was a task sewn into her long-held values, the same integrity guiding her hands to sew perfect hems and seams. They had been her service for many years, a service rooted in care and reliability, even as others might falter for convenience. Ensuring safety, even here, was something she felt responsible for while still within these grounds that had disregarded her so thoroughly. Walking further along the estate's perimeter, Zoe noticed a low wooden fence bordering a field lying mostly empty save for clusters of daisies that had taken over the forgotten space. Here, tethered under the fading sun, she saw a dog, tail still, pence echoing a slow discontent with the heat. Its eyes met Zoe's with a gaze that mirrored recognition, an outsider within opulence, briefly overlooked and set aside. Zoe was a lifelong animal lover, a warmth cultivated growing up amidst her family's patchwork quilt of adopted pets and creatures needing a home. She approached the animal cautiously, reading its silent acceptance of her approach as it bore a demeanor less fierce, more forlorn. Taking a mental note of its condition and snapping a photo, Zoe dialed the local animal welfare agency. "Hello," she began, voice steadying as she explained the neglect she'd observed. The agency attendant thanked her for her vigilance, promising to send someone to investigate shortly. As the call ended, Zoe held the phone, feeling the texture of its familiar corners. This small device connected her to something bigger, a catalyst to speak against wrongs, to rise beyond her own grievances by acting with a justice beyond reproach, integrity that could not be mocked or ignored. The journey she began that morning as a modest outing to enjoy, transformed into an occasion of unforeseen advocacy. Every path since leaving the tasting room had pulled her further from her initial disappointment and closer to the steadfast resolve she possessed when protecting all that was too easily overlooked, whether fabric or fur. As Zoe made her way to the estate's main road, the horizon reflected its parting hues upon her as it wove her return journey home. In her hands, she held not just a purse of fabric and needlework but the courage pieced from today's tapestry of revelations. She had walked willingly into a sphere beyond her own, surprised by its sting yet enduring its challenges with persistent grace. By alerting the authorities, Zoe had spun her scant power into something substantial, into a narrative where simple truth and compassion cut through the vines of deceit laced across quiet, shaded vineyards. It was a reminder that dignity was a fabric sewn into the seams, unchanged by residues of prideful projection. Her pace quickened as she passed through the gates, resolute in spirit, eyes clear, appreciating how one could transcend ordinary circumstances. The day had not stripped her of her hopes but redirected them to a purpose nestled against life's tougher realities, which she found and faced with indomitable bravery. As Zoe headed home, she considered the path yet before her, laced with the possibility of new beginnings, hemmed by experiences sown from today's scenery. She anticipated tomorrow's dawn with a refreshed heart, each beat embodying a rhythm of life stitched to the eternal craft of an enduring seamstress. The morning after Zoe's visit to the winery, the local news stations hummed with a story that ignited curiosity across the town. A prominent media outlet ran a headline, "Safety violations at renowned winery cause stir following anonymous tip." The wine estate, known for its exclusivity, now fell under public scrutiny as information regarding its hazardous oversights came to light. Zoe, seated at her kitchen table with her morning tea steaming gently against the crisp air, couldn't have anticipated the effect of her actions. She had spent the previous evening stitching work orders and then drifted into a restless sleep, the events of the day cycling through her thoughts like a refrain knit into the tapestry of her mind. As she turned the pages of the morning newspaper, her eyes widened at the article detailing how fire safety inspectors had descended upon the winery shortly after her departure. Inspectors found the fire exits padlocked shut, extinguishers past expiration, and documented safety protocols practically non-existent. It wasn't just a violation, it was a scandal that rocked the foundations of the winery's prestige. Meanwhile, social media platforms buzzed with outrage as the winery's negligence trended throughout the community. With the winery's umbrella of untouchable luxury pulled back, patrons shared their stories of similar slights and dismissive moments hidden behind polished facades. The cruel mockery Zoe had endured became symbolic of a more widespread discontent with establishments treating customers of lesser means with condescendence. The public outcry bloomed into a chorus of voices demanding accountability. The winery's management issued a hasty apology, promising to rectify all safety lapses and ensure the estate adhered to the highest standards moving forward, but the damage extended deeper than physical repairs. Their reputation lay precarious, balancing on the pivot of public redress. In tandem with the safety inspections, the local animal welfare organization was on site the next day, investigating the conditions of the winery's estate dog, which had been left unattended. The dog was retrieved and transferred to a nearby rescue center, prompting an additional wave of indignation from animal rights groups and further tarnishing the reputation of the once celebrated winery. A community gossip column snatched up the human angle, further disseminating details of the anonymous whistleblower. It wasn't long before those familiar with Zoe's voice suspected her involvement. Facilitative whispers morphed into appreciative acknowledgments across the community, as many patrons who had their own axes to grind found courage in the unveiling. Zoe began receiving visits from familiar faces in her neighborhood, clients, acquaintances, and even people she barely knew. They brought flowers, baked goods, and words of encouragement, transforming her apartment from a quiet sanctuary into the heart of their spontaneous gratitude. Although initially overwhelmed by the attention, Zoe's heart swelled with a warmer emotion, one of reclaimed dignity. Her actions had unwittingly become a catalyst, inspiring others to speak openly about their experiences. It amazed her to see how small, quiet gestures could unfold into messages of larger change. One particular visit stood out among the rest. An elderly couple, longtime patrons of her seamstress skills, arrived with hand-knitted scarves and an envelope filled with thank-you notes from countless community members. Tears formed in Zoe's eyes, no longer from moments of derision, but from belonging and recognition, things she hadn't allowed herself to dream possible from this ordeal. In the following days, local authorities and state officials announced they were considering more extensive inspections across similar venues, assessing safety protocols and guest treatment. The implications of Zoe's initial report stretched wider, encouraging broader scrutiny that promised to make such establishments safer, more inclusive, and held to account for their interactions with patrons of every background. Meanwhile, the winery's internal turmoil climaxed with the public suspension of the sommelier who had ridiculed Zoe. The guide's departure statement attempted a shallow apology that was poorly received, and his actions were openly criticized by the company as contrary to its values, although few believed this rhetoric would have changed without the current sky-high pressure. Yet, amid the rigorous scrutiny and social discourse, Zoe found her name kept quiet in official records. Her involvement remained a whispered acknowledgement confined to community whispers and felt praises, as it was her choice, her humility preserving her anonymity. These developments invigorated Zoe, grounding her on a path where dignity and composure paved the way for change. She marveled at how events had unfolded like another sequence of carefully tacked stitches, unexpected yet underpinned by a steady rhythm she had crafted, connecting actions greater than anticipated. With each visit, message, and shared nod of understanding, Zoe recognized an enduring truth, that her life had intertwined with others beyond the boundaries she thought confined by circumstance. Her act had sparked something larger, igniting quieter voices who, like her, once remained in shadow. It was a transformation not just within the winery or the community but also in Zoe's understanding of the power she wielded, a power steeped not in grand gestures or worldly positions but the quiet fortitude of integrity and compassion. The repercussions of her actions continued to ripple outward, bringing sweeping improvements to other establishments, all demanding higher transparency and respect for every visitor. The world had changed a little, tilted more justly, because she stood firm in her values. As the days unfolded and the impact of those changes deepened, Zoe found herself beginning to reclaim her own narrative, stitching together a life enhanced by courage, acknowledged not for its status, but for its steadfast resilience, a tapestry uniquely hers to weave. Weeks passed, and the uproar surrounding the winery subsided into the folds of memory, leaving behind a landscape altered by accountability and reform. For Zoe, life resumed its gentle rhythm, interwoven with new textures of confidence and acceptance. Returning to her work, stitching alongside the gentle hum of her sewing machine, she felt a quiet satisfaction unlike any she had known before. Though the outer circumstances of her life remained largely unchanged, Zoe herself had transformed. The muted resolve she carried within was now visible, etched subtly into her posture as she walked through familiar streets, head held high. Her clients, neighbors, and even passers-by sensed it, a regal dignity that defied the simplicity of her dress and the modesty of her station. One morning, she discovered a small, official-looking envelope tucked among the usual assortment of letters on her doorstep. Inside was a thoughtful note from the local fire safety authority, acknowledging her anonymous act. It thanked her for her vigilant concern, affirming that her report had been instrumental in enforcing safety protocols that might otherwise have languished in dormancy. The letter closed with a request for her to attend a community meeting to share insights, if she wished. Holding the letter, Zoe allowed herself a moment of pride. Her actions, even those made in anonymity, reshaped public spaces to be fairer, more considerate places. It was a validation that carried more weight than public acclaim, for it resonated with her inner conviction that her inherent worth and capability extended beyond the visible seams of her life. The winery, in a bid to recover its standing, had reached out formally to offer her an apology and an invitation to revisit under warmer pretenses. Their missive was politely worded, florid even in its eagerness to mend the breach. But Zoe understood her peace came not from stepping back into that world, but from staying grounded within her own. Gracefully, she penned a brief response, acknowledging their apology but declining the return, choosing instead to forge ahead on her path, new horizons informed by lessons lived. For Zoe, the richness she sought was not stitched into the fabric of elitist escapades but rather within the shared humanity she had helped illuminate. The weeks had brought other changes. As Zoe walked her daily route past the winery, she noticed tangible shifts. A new sign prominently displayed boasted, "Safety Certified. All are welcome," gleaming in the sun as testament to the revised principles now securely housed within its elegant halls. The air tinged with vines bore witness to their evolution, inspired by the honesty she had played a part in seeding. Witnessing these changes, Zoe felt more than vindication, she saw potential. It spoke of the power found in small but purposeful acts, ordinary people extending beyond inflictions of judgment or disdain. And she saw it reflected in the everyday exchanges, in the soft thank yous and shared smiles from friends and clients, acknowledgments that lifted her spirit on any given day. Afternoons gathered into evenings with the warmth of camaraderie anew. Zoe opened her home to gatherings with friends, colleagues, and neighbors, an impromptu circle of connection colored by laughter, shared stories, and a renewed sense of community. It was here, gathered around her small living room with mugs of fragrant tea and plates of simple but wholesome offerings, that those who knew Zoe best saw the true richness of spirit she possessed. Conversations drifted between fabrics, futures, and shared jokes, each thread weaving a new tapestry of community. Finally, with the early onset of dusk painting the sky in tones of purple and gold, Zoe stepped out onto her small balcony overlooking the bustling street below. She watched the silhouettes of homes emerge, people weaving life's patterns across the city's expanse. Here was life in its frank, radiant feature, earned and enduring, as fulfilling as any passing indulgence housed behind grandiose facades. Zoe's heart thrummed with a sense of quiet triumph, humbled by its unassuming breadth. On the horizon danced the promise of new experiences unfurling each day, bolstered by the richness of legacy, solidarity, and dreams bound not by circumstance but by the boundless fabric of possibility. And so she stood, sipping her tea as the bustling sounds of the city began to lull. Her journey, stitched with patience, strength, and resilience, had revealed an intrinsic truth: she never needed status or external validation. Her courage and kindness were sufficient to shape worlds simply by affirming that anyone, regardless of background, carried the potential to inspire change where it mattered most. As the evening settled into its cloak of stars, Zoe retreated inside, her laughter mingling with the quiet clang of porcelain and silverware from neighbors' kitchens, a symphony of lives lived authentically. It was here, cradled within the familiar embrace of her dwelling, that Zoe found both her sanctuary and her stage, a place endowed by the spirit and grace of the uncelebrated, made noble by profound simplicity and enduring resolve.